The Misadventures of an Escape Artist, Episode 1. To you who have taken the time to read my story, and for those of you who can read between the lines, greetings and salutations. I've lived a charmed life, doing almost everything I wanted to do. Sure, I have suffered a few disappointments, but nothing that made me tumble so low to not to be able to get up again and to amaze even me. I consider myself a rational person. However, there have been times in both my personal and professional life when my inner child has ruled the roost. My protagonist is named Antoine because of my fascination with the hero Antoine de Saint-Exupéry. He was the author of The Little Prince, the pilot and writer who was born in June 1900 and died in flight over the Mediterranean in 1944. A brief history of me. I'm the oldest of three boys, born in the Eastern Townships in the province of Quebec. I must have been born under a shooting star, as I've been successful in all that I wanted to accomplish without working too hard. Throughout my life, I've always told myself, rather than becoming very good at one thing, one job, I decided to be middling at everything. Life is short, so enjoy, have fun, kick up those heels. I've worked as a hired hand, day labourer, musician, actor, jet airline pilot, an entrepreneur, and even as a CEO of my own 3 international companies. I was fortunate enough to start my aviation career when flight regulations were not yet strictly enforced. Planes flew overloaded, poorly maintained, and in dangerous weather conditions. On the other hand, I was able to go through experiences and meet people I would never have had the chance to get to know today. So, ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. Welcome to Air Le Roi. Please place yourself in a comfortable position and fasten your seatbelts. Tricking the Grim Reaper. Water has always been a special part of my life. I'm a good swimmer, always ready to do a few laps in open water or in a pool. I had just turned 15 and was frolicking in Lake Memphremagog at the cottage belonging to the father of my friend Michel. This lake is famous for supposed sightings of the Loch Ness monster-like Memphrey. We were horsing around doing belly flops at the end of the dock. As the water was only a few feet deep, we made sure that we landed on our bellies or backs to avoid hurtling into the shallows. Just when I was about to do my final belly flop, Michel reached out and touched my back, which threw me off kilter. I plunged into the water, crashing my head into the bottom of the lake. I felt no pain and saw my astral body floating weightlessly above me, hovering 3 feet above the water. Suddenly, I felt myself being propelled towards a brilliant light. I'd never felt so free, so happy, or so safe. I continued floating towards the light when suddenly I felt like I'd been sucked back into my earthly body. It was as if someone was grabbing me by the collar and stuffing me back inside myself. I stumbled out of the lake, staggered to Michel's cottage, and collapsed on the living room couch. My left arm began to go numb. It felt as if the blood on my whole left side had suddenly stopped flowing. Michel's mother ran next door to fetch a chiropractor. He foolishly told me that I had only pulled a muscle and I would be fine in a day or two. My father arrived at the cottage and wanted to call an ambulance, but I adamantly refused. As I couldn't sit, he laid me in the cargo area of his station wagon and took me to the small town hospital about 15 minutes away. The doctor on duty told my father that I had to be quickly taken to the university hospital located 40 minutes away. Luckily, that week, a conference of spinal specialists was being held at that hospital. As soon as we arrived by ambulance at Sherbrooke University Hospital, I was placed on a steel table. I remember lying there for almost 4 hours, waiting for the doctors to decide what to do with me. I could hear the medical specialists discussing my case. I overheard one of the doctors say he doubted if I would survive the day. Another doctor said I would most likely end up a quadriplegic. One physician told me that I must have very powerful legs to be able to stand up, wade out of the water, and make my way to the cottage. What was bothering me most of all was I was still in my wet trunks, the steel table freezing against my bare skin. It was hours before a decision to place me in traction was made. Holes were drilled on each side of my head, at the bottom of the parietal bone. As there are no nerve connections in this area of bodies, I felt no pain, but the vibrations of the drill were curious. They moved me to a hospital bed for the rest of the procedure. An ice tongue-like device with 2 arms was inserted into the 2 holes on either side of my head. Attached to these arms was a traction cable that went to a pulley at the head of the bed, which held a weight of a few pounds. The bed had a slight slope which kept my cervical vertebrae stretched so as not to crush the cervical fluid. Following this procedure, every 15 minutes a nurse would come in to check on my reflexes to make sure that all my limbs and muscles were responding normally. I remember my friend Michel visited me at the hospital. One moment he was standing in front of me, then the next he suddenly disappeared. He had fainted and was lying on the floor. When he came to a few seconds later, he crawled out of the room. He couldn't bear seeing me in traction. After a week, I underwent surgery on my first 3 cervical vertebrae. 2 of my vertebrae were welded together, and a piece of bone was taken from my right hip to secure the 3rd. I spent 8 hours on the operating table, and then 3 weeks lying on my back in traction, with ice tongs on either side of my head to keep me from moving. A few days after my operation, my cousin Gilles came to my bedside. Looking at the ice tongs, we were both laughing like idiots. The tongs reminded us of rabbit ears, those TV antennas from yesteryear. Gilles asked me if I could receive television broadcasts in my head. I sadly found that laughing was not the best idea. Any movement was agony in the first few days following the operation. The nurse insisted that Gilles had to leave. The nurse that cared for me was the highlight of my day. I don't remember her name or even her face, but I remember her scent and the way my heart beat when she was near. After many days lying in a hospital bed, I was able to slowly turn my left side and see my reflection in the mirror on the wall. I'd always been healthy with a clear complexion. Oh, what a sight! I saw that my face was covered with acne. I realized that the nurse had seen me like this. I was devastated. I thought to myself that I didn't care if I ended up a paraplegic for the rest of my life. I just couldn't deal with looking like a monster in front of the nurse. 2 weeks after my operation, I was put in a cast that went from my waist to the top of my head. There was an opening for my face and a space for my chest so I could breathe properly. For the cast, I had to be moved to a sitting position. A nurse stood at the head of my bed and held the cable attached to the clamps that were holding my head still. Maintaining the tension, the nurses lifted me into a sitting position on the edge of the bed. Once in that posture, warm plaster was applied around my body. A few days later, I was able to go back home. I would be confined in this plaster jail for more than 4 months. I was not in any pain, but scratching my back with a ruler was a bitch. Return home. When I came home after a month in the hospital, my parents brought me a stereo sound system that used compact cassettes. In those days, this was the new wave in electronics. I had bought some blues and rock tapes, Johnny and Edgar Winter, Deep Purple, Frank Zappa. I listened to Winter's Frankenstein, Zappa's Stinkfoot, and to Deep Purple's Smoke on the Water. The song starts with the guitar playing with a fuzz effect. Since I knew very little about music, except for playing trumpet in 8th grade, I thought it was the bassist who played the riff, so I asked my father to buy me a bass guitar so I could play that famous run. I couldn't swim, couldn't ride my bike or play in the streets with friends, so I played bass guitar. I started playing bass by listening to tapes, blues, rock and jazz. At the end of November, the cast was removed and I spent a few months with a foam cervical collar. While being interviewed at flight school, I never mentioned my accident, as I would surely have been rejected. Life's little lessons, shit and sweet madness. In the summer of my 16th birthday, I was hired to work as an orderly in a hospital for children with mental development problems. The people from the area referred to Butters as the hospital for the insane kids, the crazy people hospital, or the loony bin. The facility was located across from the Lake Menfrey Magog and the Benoit du Lac Abbey in the beautiful Eastern Townships. Lily Esther Butters, who lived from 1894 to 1980, built this private hospital for a working class clientele who did not have the resources to put their sick or mentally disabled children in a specialized institution. The hospital opened its doors in 1948 with 6 patients living in her original farmhouse situated along Lake Memphremagog. When the government of Quebec purchased the institution in 1972, there were 435 residents. When the government opted to deinstitutionalize people, Butters closed its doors in 1980. Some of these people were sick, some were just different, and some only needed help to survive in society. Most of these mistreated, unwanted souls ended up being homeless. I've been hired to work from 9 to 5 every day. They hired me because I was 6 feet tall, slim, and physically strong. The other workers at the centre were mostly women and not nearly as muscular. I was put in charge of 10 boys between the ages of 18 and 24. They spent all day wearing football helmets in a padded room, banging their heads against the wall. According to the doctors in the centre, the boys had mental ages between 10 months and a year and a half. Needless to say, they all wore heavy cotton diapers. During the day I had to bathe them often because they covered themselves in feces. It was not easy to get them into the bath, but it was the only way I could keep them fairly clean. I spent hours swimming in poop, so, at the end of the day, I was literally full of shit. The first week was emotionally challenging. After that week, I felt perfectly at ease in this environment of shit and sweet madness. I loved my group of new friends. One of my main jobs was to feed my boys, as they didn't know how to eat using utensils. There was an employee at the centre who worked at night. He hit the boys and abused them. After suffering from this unforgivable treatment, one of my little friends, who had actually been taught to eat on his own, regressed and never ate by himself again. I was shaken by witnessing this inhumanity, but assumed I had no authority to speak up. During the 3 months that I worked in the centre, I never saw any of the children's parents come to visit. In the first 10 years of operation, 75 children died in the hospital, and in most cases, the parents never even bothered to show up for their child's funeral. They were buried with a Christian ceremony at the East Bolton Cemetery near the Butters Centre, a place with a beautiful view of the lake, and in summer months you can smell the wildflowers and sweet fields that surround the graves. I remember one of the patients who never spoke, never even made a sound. One morning he opened his arms to embrace me and clearly said, "Mummy." I must have opened a wee door in his innocent soul. It made me happy and sad at the same time. Day tripping. The centre had funds for activities, but none of the employees ever used the money. The hospital had a small van that could seat 10 people. Talking to the Butters Centre director one morning, I suggested taking some of the more adjusted teenagers into town to see a film. I headed for the cinema in the early afternoon with my 8 new friends in the centre's van. When we got to the theatre, the film had already started. There was only my little group and 2 other spectators. Naturally, after 30 minutes of sitting still in the theatre, my teenage patients had had enough. As we were leaving, I noticed there was a poster of the female star in the lobby. Suddenly, 2 of the boys undid their pants and exposed themselves to the poster. Boys will be boys. I told them to pull up their pants and move along. We left the cinema and got back into the van. I made an impromptu stop at a convenience store to buy them candies before returning to Butters. The 9 of us had an amazing time outside of the hospital grounds. The next day, I went back to working with my boys in their padded room. The following summer, because of the closure of the Butters Centre, I worked in a Christmas tree nursery. I needed a well-paying job for my flight school tuition.